On the morning of October 17, 1898, Father Matthias Keller stood alone beneath the worn limestone arches of St. Aldren's Church, a forgotten parish tucked into the wooded hills of southern Germany. For more than 3 centuries, no member of the clergy had crossed the iron gate beneath the sanctuary. Parish records called the space below simply the lower crypt, followed by a single instruction in faded Latin: "Remain sealed unless ordered by the bishop." No explanation followed it. There never had been one, not in 300 years of priests who inherited the rule and never once tested it. That autumn, heavy rains had weakened the foundations, and the bishop, more concerned with cracked stone than old superstition, finally granted permission to inspect what lay beneath. It seemed at the time like the most ordinary of decisions. It would become the least understood episode in the parish's history. Workers cleared stone that hadn't moved since the 17th century. Father Keller followed them down with a brass lantern that barely reached the staircase ahead of him. The air rising to meet him smelled of damp earth and stillness so complete it felt almost solid. With every step, the world above grew quieter. The bells first, then the workers' voices, until only his own footsteps remained. The crypt itself was almost a disappointment. Stone pillars, a vaulted ceiling, a row of weathered sarcophagi, their inscriptions worn nearly to nothing. Nothing here looked like it deserved 300 years of silence. Then Keller raised the lantern, and instead of the floor, his eyes went to the ceiling. Carved, not painted, not written, carved. Directly into the stone above him was an inscription that covered almost the entire vault. Hundreds of characters followed the curve of the ceiling with a precision that should not have been possible by candlelight and chisel. Between the lines ran symbols that matched nothing he recognized from a lifetime in the church. Crosses bent into unfamiliar shapes, circles split by geometric lines, small star-like figures arranged in patterns that seemed to follow some logic of their own. He later told a colleague that he stood there for several minutes without moving before he called the workers back inside. What happened over the following days is, even now, remarkably hard to piece together. Some records mention measurements taken of the chamber, others reference sketches. One inventory lists several pages of Keller's own handwritten notes. Almost none of it can be found today. The crypt was sealed again. The inscription faded from conversation. Father Keller spoke publicly about what he'd found exactly once, and then, almost as quickly as it had reappeared, the entire discovery seemed to slide out of history. What was carved onto that ceiling? And why would anyone go to such lengths to carve a message in the one place in the building where almost no living person would ever stand to read it? That question is where this investigation begins. History is full of forgotten churches. Across Europe, thousands of medieval crypts sit beneath cathedrals, monasteries, and village chapels, and most of them hold exactly what you'd expect: burials, relics, inscriptions for the dead. Architectural footnotes, nothing more. St. Aldren's was different in one specific way, not in what it contained, but in how little anyone had ever been allowed to look. The church itself was never important. It stood off the trade routes, drew no pilgrims, attached itself to no famous events. Its archive was thin. Its priests rotated quickly. What history survived did so mostly through parish ledgers and the kind of oral tradition that gets passed down without anyone remembering where it started. That obscurity is probably why no one noticed the crypt was missing from the record, until a handful of 19th century historians cataloging rural church architecture mentioned almost in passing that part of St. Aldren's foundation was inaccessible even to the parish. No elaboration, no follow-up. The kind of detail that reads as ordinary until you understand what it's sitting on top of. Because restrictions like that were not common. Churches protected relics, they guarded burial chambers, but a flat prohibition lasting centuries needed real justification. Canon law leaned toward preservation, not permanent exile. So why had this one chamber stayed closed for generation after generation, long enough that no one left alive could say why? The earliest answer the records offer goes back to the late 12th century, in a document that isn't about construction at all. It's a land donation, made to a small religious community already settled on the site, which means whatever stood there before the surviving church was older than anyone had bothered to write down. Later archaeological surveys backed that up. The stonework under the visible sanctuary used different masonry, different mortar, different proportions than anything above it. The unmistakable signature of a much older structure buried beneath a newer one. That's not unusual in itself. Shrines become chapels, chapels become churches, layer by layer, century by century. St. Aldren fits the pattern almost exactly, except for one detail that doesn't fit at all. The crypt's vaulted ceiling is older than some of the walls holding it up. Historians who later studied sketches of the chamber noticed the inconsistency immediately. The columns belonged to one architectural period, while sections of the ceiling reflected techniques from another, earlier one. Normally, that gap runs the other way: old walls, newer repairs. Here it was reversed, as if builders had gone out of their way to preserve something that already mattered to them before they finished the room around it. Which raises the obvious question. Medieval inscriptions live on walls, tombs, entrances, anywhere a person can stand and read them without effort. Ceilings are different. A message carved overhead forces a kind of posture nobody adopts by accident. You cannot simply glance at it, you have to stop, tilt your head back, and choose to look. If it was decoration, the labor involved was absurd for something almost no one would ever see. But if it was a warning, or something closer to an instruction, the location finally starts to make sense. A cluster of 16th century correspondence adds a second thread to the story. Letters between local clergy and the diocese discuss water damage beneath the sanctuary, and one of them, almost in passing, advises against disturbing the upper stone markings until proper authority can review them. The phrase appears exactly once. No description, no drawing. No way to know if markings meant cracks, decoration, or something else. But decades later, another document records money spent reinforcing the entrance to the crypt, not the chamber itself, just the way in. By the early 17th century, the language in the parish inventory shifts again. The crypt isn't described as damaged or neglected anymore. It's described as sealed. That word choice matters more than it looks like it should. Abandoned places are forgotten because no one bothers with them. Sealed places are watched. Someone, somewhere along that chain of priests and bishops, kept deliberately remembering what was down there, even after everyone else had stopped asking. By the time that memory reached Father Keller in 1898, it had worn down to nothing but a rule with no reason attached. His own letters describe a man far more interested in leaking roofs and parish charity than medieval symbolism. Nothing in his background suggests he was looking for a mystery. He simply happened to be the one standing at the bottom of the stairs when 300 years of silence finally ran out. When Keller came back up that afternoon, the workers waiting at the top expected a routine report on the foundations. Instead, witnesses described him as distracted, short with questions, careful to forbid anyone from re-entering without his permission, and asking for writing materials before he'd speak to anyone else. What he wrote in the hours that followed is one of the biggest gaps in this entire story. Later inventories mention a leather notebook, sketches of the ceiling, chamber measurements, partial transcriptions of carved lines. That notebook has never resurfaced. Its existence is known only because other clergy referenced having seen it, before it vanished from the parish archive sometime in the early 20th century. But a few fragments survived elsewhere, scattered across letters that were never meant to be read together. One came from Keller himself, in a letter to the diocesan office written just 3 days after he first went down. It opens routinely, structural notes, repair recommendations, reassurance that the sanctuary above wasn't in danger. Then, abruptly, it turns. Keller asks for permission to consult specialists in medieval Latin and church symbolism before any restoration continues, and insists, without explaining why, that the ceiling could not be dismissed as ordinary decoration. According to his own words, the text looked intentional, systematic, unlike any funerary inscription he'd encountered in his ministry. Then comes the stranger request. He asks that no one clean the carved surface until proper copies were made. On its own, that sounds like simple caution. But church crews routinely cleaned stonework before documenting it. That was standard practice, not an exception. So why preserve centuries of dust? Some historians think the grime had settled into the engraved grooves and made the carving more legible, not less. Others think the opposite, that cleaning risked stripping away pigment still sitting in the letters. Either way, Keller understood within 3 days that he was looking at something that mattered. Within weeks, more people had gone down to see it. A regional historian who specialized in medieval manuscripts, a stonemason familiar with Romanesque construction, and at least one scholar capable of reading the kind of Latin abbreviations found in old ecclesiastical texts. Their names survive only in scraps, a personal letter here, a travel reimbursement in a diocesan ledger there. What they discussed underground is mostly lost. But one line survives from a private letter one of those scholars wrote months later. He described the sealing as remarkably inconsistent with its presumed date. He never explains what he meant, but historians have spent a long time guessing that the vocabulary belonged to a later century than the chamber itself, that the lettering style reflected techniques not yet developed when the crypt was supposedly built, that the symbols traced back to monastic traditions with no obvious connection to that region, or, more unsettling than any of those, that the inscription wasn't carved once at all, but added to, layer after layer, by different hands across different generations. Any one of those possibilities would complicate the official history of the chamber. Together, they suggest something closer to an ongoing project than a single act of construction, which means someone kept adding to a message inside a crypt that was, on paper, permanently closed. The physical shape of the inscription only deepens that puzzle. Unlike a memorial text running in straight lines, this one reportedly followed the curve of the vault in expanding rings, growing denser the closer it got to the ceiling's highest point. And at that center sat a single symbol no one could agree on how to describe. An 8-pointed star, according to one witness. Overlapping circles inside a larger ring, according to another. A third called it simply the central seal, and left it at that. No drawing of it has ever surfaced. Every description that exists comes secondhand, filtered through someone's memory of someone else's letter, which has become the defining frustration of this entire case. The closer you get to the one detail that might actually explain something, the thinner the evidence gets. What the letters do agree on is harder to ignore. One diocesan official wrote that the arrangement complicates ordinary reading. Another said its layout appears to require movement. Neither explains further, but both are describing the same idea from different angles. This wasn't a text meant to be read standing still. It may have needed to be walked beneath, section by section, or followed an astronomical alignment instead of a narrative one, or wove more than one language through it at once. Without the original, all of that stays speculation. But the pattern is consistent enough to suggest the inscription communicated through layout as much as through words. That wouldn't be unprecedented. Medieval builders occasionally folded symbolic geometry directly into sacred architecture. Cathedrals aligned to solstices, labyrinths built as spiritual journeys, vaults shaped to echo the order of the heavens. Architecture as theology, built in stone instead of written in scripture. It's possible St. Aldren's crypt belongs to that same tradition, just unusually elaborate. Or it's possible the builders were doing something else entirely. Local oral tradition offers one more thread, thin as it is. Throughout the 19th century, older residents in the area would occasionally repeat a saying tied to the church, something that translates roughly to, "The dead rest below, the words remain above." For most of that century, it was treated as harmless folklore. Nobody connected it to an actual inscription, because almost no one alive had ever set foot in the Sealed Crypt. It was only after Keller's discovery that historians realized the saying might be an authentic memory, distorted by generations of retelling but never quite erased, which raises an odd question of its own. How do villagers remember the existence of words on a ceiling no one had seen in living memory? Folklore usually survives as a blur. Names disappear, details shift, but certain images persist almost unchanged. A carved ceiling sealed beneath a church is exactly the kind of image that would outlast its own explanation. A restoration invoice from nearly 200 years before Keller's inspection adds a more concrete piece. The expense report authorizes work reinforcing the staircase down into the crypt, and nothing else. Not the chamber, not the ceiling, just the entrance. If the goal had been preserving the space, that makes little sense. If the goal was controlling access to it, it makes a great deal of sense. That reading lines up with a bishop's directive issued decades after that, stating flatly that no clergy, under any circumstance, could enter the lower crypt without written diocesan authorization, emergency repairs included. No justification given. None needed, apparently. Restrictions that absolute were almost unheard of for an ordinary burial vault. And St. Aldren wasn't alone. Archival research elsewhere turned up scattered references, monasteries hundreds of kilometers away, mentioning sealed underground chapels with inscriptions that were never formally copied or catalogued. Most of those sites were lost outright, to war, to fire, to renovation that simply filled the chambers with rubble. None matched St. Aldren precisely. But the pattern across all of them was the same: restricted access, thin documentation, and a slow fade out of institutional memory despite surviving for centuries. Whether any of these places were actually connected is impossible to prove. The resemblance is hard to dismiss anyway. The detail that changes everything arrives in 1912, more than a decade after Keller first went underground. Another priest, writing a private letter to a colleague about parish history, mentions the chamber almost as an aside. The letter only survives because it was kept among family papers instead of church records. It was never meant to be part of the official archive at all. The line itself is short. It says that Father Keller came to believe the inscription was intended not for those entering the crypt, but for those leaving it. No explanation follows. Just that. On its own, it could pass for a turn of phrase. But think about the geometry of the room. Someone walking down into the crypt is watching uneven steps in lantern light, looking down, not up. It's only on the way out, turning back toward the stairs, that the ceiling stays continuously in view. If the inscription really was meant for people leaving rather than arriving, its entire purpose changes. It's not a warning posted at the threshold. It's something meant to travel back up into daylight with whoever read it. Which might explain why Keller spent so long with it before ordering the chamber resealed, and why, not long after, the evidence of his investigation began disappearing right along with the meaning of what he'd found. By the 1910s, Keller's discovery had shrunk down to a stray reference buried in diocesan paperwork. The crypt was sealed again. The men who had briefly studied its sealing had died, retired, or scattered to other parishes. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became a different kind of mystery. Not about what was carved into the stone, but about why so little proof of the investigation survived to be questioned at all. The parish archive itself is in good shape. Baptismal registers going back centuries, financial ledgers, property records, even routine letters about broken windows survived intact. But almost everything tied to the 1898 inspection is simply gone. The notebook, the sketches, the transcription Keller asked for in his own letter. Even the visiting historian, a man with an extensive publication record on medieval architecture, never once mentioned St. Aldren by name in any of his surviving work. Archives lose things constantly for boring reasons: war, flood, fire, simple misfiling. But the pattern here is too specific to wave away that easily. Documents from before the inspection survive. Documents from long after survive. The only material that consistently vanishes is the material that touches the crypt directly. There's a practical explanation. Papers borrowed for study and never returned, which happens more often than archivists would like to admit. There's also a less comfortable one, that someone, at some point, decided the investigation needed to stop having a paper trail. No direct evidence supports that second explanation, but the irregularities are specific enough to keep the question open. One of those irregularities sits in a 1926 diocesan inventory, which lists a folder labeled only "Materials Relating to the Lower Chamber." Beside it, a clerk added a single handwritten word: transferred, no destination, no date, no receiving institution. From that point on, the folder simply isn't anywhere. Not in regional archives, not in cathedral collections, not in any diocesan repository historians have since searched. The silence got louder, not quieter, after the Second World War. As bombed churches across Europe were rebuilt, archaeologists reopened crypts that had sat untouched for generations, forgotten tombs documented, hidden murals photographed, buried features written up for academic journals. St. Aldren's crypt, barely registered. Official surveys confirmed it existed. Almost none described the interior in any detail, and fewer still mentioned the inscription at all. Some called it generically historic carvings and moved on. For a chamber that supposedly held one of the strangest sealing inscriptions ever reported under a parish church, that's a strange amount of nothing. Modern tools haven't closed the gap either. Ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning have transformed how underground religious architecture gets studied. Chambers like this one could now be documented in far more detail than Keller ever could have managed with a lantern and a notebook. No complete digital survey of St. Aldren's crypt has ever entered the public record. Whether one simply hasn't been done, or has been done and never released, is impossible to say from the outside. That gap is exactly where the more dramatic theories tend to live. Secret maps, hidden prophecies, forbidden doctrine, astronomical codes the church supposedly buried on purpose. They're appealing because they offer certainty the historical record refuses to provide. But nothing in the surviving evidence supports any of that, and it's worth saying plainly. No document describes a miraculous find. None mentions anything supernatural. None claims the inscription held knowledge capable of rewriting history overnight. What the record actually shows is quieter, and arguably more interesting for it. An inscription existed. It was significant enough that trained scholars traveled to study it. Its structure puzzled people who knew what they were looking at. Access to it was tightly controlled for centuries, and the records produced while studying it mostly disappeared. That's the whole of it. It doesn't need embellishment to be strange. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about the inscription at all, but about how historical memory actually erodes. History gets imagined as a complete archive, sitting patiently and waiting to be read in full. In practice, it behaves more like a damaged mosaic. Most of the pieces missing, the survivors stripped of context, and every so often, a single surviving fragment that contradicts everything built around it. St. Aldren's ceiling may be exactly that kind of fragment. A piece that forces an uncomfortable question about how many discoveries were carefully documented and then quietly lost, and how many investigations didn't end because anyone found an answer. They ended because eventually people simply stopped asking. Father Matthias Keller almost certainly never imagined that more than a century later, strangers on the other side of the world would still be talking about the chamber he entered once, with a single lantern, on an ordinary October morning. He doesn't read in his own letters like a man chasing legend. He reads like a parish priest who stumbled into something he didn't expect and tried, as carefully as he could, to handle it correctly, asking for experts before drawing conclusions, asking for documentation before cleaning, asking for patience before certainty. That restraint is, in its own way, the most compelling part of the whole story. Keller drew almost no conclusions of his own, and because of that, he left the question wide open for everyone who came after him. Maybe the inscription was eventually translated somewhere, by someone, and judged too unremarkable to keep tracking. In which case, the loss of every supporting document is just an unfortunate accident of archival history, nothing more. Or maybe the scholars who stood under that ceiling recognized something that genuinely didn't fit anywhere in the accepted record, and the silence that followed wasn't an accident at all. There's no way to know which, and after more than 100 years, certainty looks less likely with every year that passes. What remains is the image itself. Beneath an aging stone church, past a staircase sealed for generations, a vaulted ceiling sits in the dark. Across its surface runs a message cut with extraordinary care by hands that turned to dust centuries ago, placed not on a wall where any visitor would naturally look, not beside a tomb, not above an altar, but directly overhead, visible only to someone willing to stop, tilt their head back, and actually look up. Maybe that was always the point. Not whether someone could get into the crypt. That part was never really the test. The test was whether they'd notice the question carved above them at all, before climbing back up the stairs and into the light. Because history has a habit of hiding its biggest mysteries in places everyone already assumes have been fully explained. And sometimes the real discovery isn't the inscription itself. It's realizing that an entire century can pass with a single question still carved in stone overhead, waiting patiently for whoever finally looks up next.